Why is urban poverty such an important issue in the development world today?
Well, sadly, the scale of urban poverty is still so large, even after 60 years of development assistance. 1 in 7 in the world's population lives in poverty in urban areas, mostly in informal settlements, also in tenements and cheap boarding houses, or literally on pavements or open spaces. Of course, conditions are very poor. There's very often serious overcrowding. There's a lack of provision for water, for sanitation, for drainage. Informal settlements often lack primary healthcare centres, schools. There's no policing, there's no rule of law, and very often it's even impossible for those living there to get on voters' registers because you need a legal address to do so.
And why is there so little response from institutions on the issue of climate change and urban poverty?
Well, tragically, most international agencies, aid agencies and development banks have given a very low priority to addressing urban poverty. In the 70s, you had this recognition that small farmers and agricultural workers weren't getting supported by aid. So you had much more support for rural poverty reduction. Now, there's been such a massive increase in urban populations and urban poverty since then, but so many aid agencies and development banks are still locked into the assumption that most poverty is in rural areas. In part, this is also because the data on urban poverty is so poor, and there's so many myths and misconceptions. For instance, using the $1 a day poverty line appears to show there's no urban poverty in much of the world. It isn't that there's not a lot of urban poverty. If you set a poverty line too low, there is no poverty.
So how are the urban poor likely to be affected by climate change?
Well, those with limited incomes and limited assets are always at risk from shocks and stresses. And of course, climate change is bringing, or will bring, in most areas of the world, more extreme rainfall, heat waves, storm surges linked to rising sea levels, constraints on water supplies, often even constraints on food, which then increases prices, which low-income groups have particular difficulty meeting. Then there's all the other risks they face because they live in informal settlements. Informal settlements so often develop on land that's unsuitable for commercial development, floodplains, steep slopes. And it's very often these have particular risks from the changes that climate change is bringing.
So what actions are the urban poor already taking to reduce their vulnerability to climate change?
Well, there's lots of coping mechanisms. It's very common, for instance, for them to build a wall around the door to their home, which means that a flood that isn't too high doesn't get into their house. They will store their valuable goods on shelves. They'll put furniture on bricks and sleep there. They'll sometimes have roofs adapted for putting material on. In some circumstances, they will join together and clean out the local storm and the surface drain. They will, especially the women, will often be members of savings groups, and the savings groups are valuable in helping them to cope with shocks and stresses. But what this does not do is to put in the storm and the surface drains and the sewers and the pipe water supplies. This doesn't provide them with land that is safe on which to build their homes and neighbourhoods. So it's coping, it's not adaptation.
Thank you very much.